Arthur was a man who found comfort in the predictable. As a high school teacher, his life was built on the unwavering reliability of a schedule. He liked the way a bell rang at the exact same second every morning. He liked the steady, rhythmic thump of his boots hitting granite. 1, 2, 1, 2, a human metronome measuring out the miles. He had come to the High Sierras not to find himself, but to experience the only thing a classroom couldn't provide: absolute, unedited silence. He wanted a world where the only sounds were his own breathing and the wind. But the Sierras had a different kind of silence in mind. A silence that felt less like an empty space and more like a tape recorder waiting for someone to speak. The first day had been a triumph of exertion. He had cleared 12 miles, his legs burning with the satisfying heat as he crested the final pass before the valley floor. But as the sun began to slip behind the jagged peaks, the atmosphere shifted. The air didn't just grow cold, it grew heavy. It lost the scent of pine and crisp snow, replaced by a dry, sterile smell that reminded Arthur of the inside of an old electronics shop: static, dust, and ozone. He set up his tent near a shallow tarn, a body of water so still it looked like a sheet of obsidian. He sat on a flat rock, unwrapping a protein bar, his fingers numb from the altitude. Then he heard it. A whistle. It was a jaunty, slightly off-key tune, the exact melody Arthur whistled when he was trying to distract himself from a steep climb. It came from the rocks 100 yards above his camp. He froze, the half-chewed bar like cardboard in his mouth. He hadn't whistled in hours. He waited, his breath shallow, watching the shadows of the boulders lengthen like reaching fingers. Precisely 10 minutes later, the whistle returned. It wasn't a natural sound carried by the wind. It was crisp, high fidelity, as if a pair of studio-grade headphones had been placed over his ears. There was no echo from the mountain walls. It was a digital clip of his own voice, played back with a terrifyingly clean edge. He crawled into his tent, clutching his bear spray, his mind racing through rationalizations. A bird? A strange trick of the canyon? But as the night wore on, the whistle grew more complex. It began to include the sound of his own breathing, the rhythmic, slightly labored huff he made between notes. The sound didn't stay on the ridge. It began to circle the tent. He could hear the crunch of gravel, not the messy, randomized crunch of a heavy animal, but the exact recorded sound of his own footfall from earlier that morning. Crunch, slide, crunch, slide. By 3 a.m., the sound was coming from directly outside the nylon wall of his tent, vibrating the very fabric. When dawn finally bled across the sky, Arthur emerged to find his boots. They had been moved from the vestibule. They were sitting 5 feet away, perfectly parallel, toes pointing north. They were buffed to a mirror shine, every speck of trail dust surgically removed, looking less like footwear and more like a museum exhibit. Arthur skipped breakfast on the second day. The sight of the boots had instilled a cold, vibrating dread in the pit of his stomach. He packed his gear with trembling hands, noticing that his tent stakes felt different. The metal was losing its burrs, its imperfections, becoming a series of perfect, frictionless cylinders. He hiked with a desperate, lung-bursting pace, trying to put distance between himself and that tarn. He didn't whistle. He didn't hum. He tried to be as silent as the rocks around him, but the mountains seemed to be listening. Every time his boot kicked a stone, the sound would repeat a second later from the trees to his left. Not as an echo, but as a playback, often slightly louder and clearer than the original. By the time he made camp on a narrow, wind-scoured ledge, the processing had moved from his gear to his environment. The ledge was too flat, the angles of the stone too precise, as if the mountain were being replaced by a digital model of itself. He sat by his small stove, the blue flame flickering in the twilight. He reached into his pack for his fleece jacket and felt the brush of skin. It wasn't his skin. It was cold, unnervingly soft, and devoid of hair or pores. A hand reached out from the depths of his own backpack, holding the corner of the fleece and offering it to him. Arthur shrieked, kicking the pack away. It tumbled toward the ledge, spilling his gear. There was no one inside. There was only his stove, his fuel, and his extra socks. But the horror was in the periphery. As he sat shaking, his headlamp beam hit the rock wall behind him. His shadow was pinned there, but it was lagging. When Arthur wiped sweat from his forehead, the shadow remained still for a full 2 seconds. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the shadow raised its arm. The shadow's hand didn't have 5 fingers. It had 7. Long, spindly protrusions that moved with the fluid grace of an underwater creature. The shadow wasn't a reflection of his body. It was a draft. Something was sketching him, trying to figure out his proportions, and it was getting the math wrong. He sat awake all night, watching his shadow occasionally twitch or blink a third eye that he didn't possess. The third day brought the vocalization. Arthur was moving through a stand of dead trees, the silvered trunks looking like the ribs of a giant. The wind had died completely, leaving a vacuum that made his ears pop. Arthur. The voice came from behind a thicket. It was his voice, but it was the version he remembered from years ago. Younger, more confident, the voice he'd had before he got tired of the world. "I'm lost, Artie. Can you show me the map?" Arthur didn't stop. He began to run, his heavy pack thumping against his spine. "You're not real," he screamed. The forest caught his scream. It took the word real, stripped the terror from it, and played it back in 1,000 different voices. He heard himself as a child, as an old man, and as the younger man from the thicket. That night, he didn't even try to sleep. He sat in the center of his tent, his headlamp pointed at his own hands. The change was undeniable now. His fingernails were turning a dull, matte gray, the ridges and cuticles smoothing over into a seamless transition of flesh. His fingerprints were fading, the unique patterns of his identity being buffed out by an invisible sandpaper. He felt a profound sense of simplification. The complexity of being a living person, the sweat, the oils, the tiny scars from childhood, was being edited out. He was being converted into a perfect Arthur, a version of himself that was optimized and clean, devoid of the messy noise of life. He touched his face. His stubble felt like soft plastic. He was becoming a recording. The fourth day was a nightmare of cinematic precision. The world began to look like a high-definition movie. The moss was too green. The sky was a blue so intense it hurt to look at. Arthur felt like an actor on a set that was being closed down around him. He found the Polaroid at 2 p.m. It was sitting on a flat stump in the middle of the trail. He picked it up with hands that felt increasingly like polymer. The photo was a high-resolution shot of a ravine 3 miles ahead. In the center of the frame, a body lay crumpled against the rocks. It was wearing his flannel shirt, his pack, his boots. The head was twisted at an impossible angle. The timestamp on the bottom read, 16:30:05. It was 3:15 p.m. Arthur realized then that the entity wasn't just a mimic, it was a director. It had already recorded his beginning and his middle, and now it was setting the stage for his end. It needed a clean, final take to finish the archive. He spent the next 2 hours in a state of panic that bordered on insanity. He crawled through the dangerous sections of the trail. He tested every rock with his weight. He refused to be a victim of the script. When he reached the ravine from the photo at 4:30 p.m., he sat down in the middle of the trail, 100 yards from the edge. He looked at his watch. 16:30, 16:31, 16:32. From the ravine below, a sound echoed up. It was the sound of a body hitting rocks. The wet thud of bones snapping, the clatter of a falling pack. It was the sound of his death, performed by the forest without him. The voice had recorded the scene anyway. It didn't need him for the final take. It just needed the audio. On the final night, Arthur was a shell of a man. He reached the lower elevations where the pines grew tall and the air felt thick. The trailhead was 5 miles away. He made his final camp, and the entity emerged from the trees. It didn't sneak. It walked out with a terrifying rhythmic stride. It looked exactly like him, but its skin was the texture of polished bone, glowing faintly in the moonlight. It had no eyes, only smooth indentations where eyes should be. It sat across the fire, mirroring his posture perfectly, and waited. It waited for Arthur to speak, to cry, to provide the live audio it needed to finish the transition. Arthur looked at the thing and felt his very identity beginning to dissolve into the air between them. He felt the urge to scream, to plead, to offer up his voice one last time. But he didn't. He did something the entity didn't expect. He stopped being a character. He didn't scream or run. He sat in total, absolute silence. He closed his eyes and focused on the internal, wordless feeling of being alive, the messy, unrecordable heat of a living heart. The entity began to glitch. Because Arthur wouldn't provide the noise, the entity had nothing to mimic. It started to repeat the whistle from the first night, but without Arthur's fear to fuel it, the sound grew thin and tinny. It began to cycle through his voices, his mother, his wife, his younger self, begging him to talk. Just one word, Arthur. Give us the clip. Arthur remained a statue for 6 hours, a man made of stone and sheer will. He let his fingernails hurt as they grew back through the marble skin. He let the cold bite into his lungs. He remained imperfect, stubborn, and silent. By the time the first ray of dawn hit the clearing, the entity had shriveled like a piece of film left too long under a hot lamp. Without the input of Arthur's presence, it couldn't maintain the form. It collapsed into a pile of gray, ash-like powder that blew away in the morning breeze. Arthur walked out of the mountains at noon. When he reached his car, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw his fingernails were back, jagged, dirty, and beautiful. He picked up his phone to call his wife, pausing to make sure he included a little rasp, a little bit of the noise that made him real. "Hey," he said, his voice beautifully imperfect. "I'm coming home." On the seat beside him, his digital watch ticked. It was 1 second off. He didn't bother to fix it. He liked the glitch. It meant he was still the one in control.